And I'll remind you when you ask any questions, I'll remind you that you are being recorded. So we might have some people join us later. So some other kind of logistics information. So I find it really difficult to, I'm assuming you guys can hear me, right? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, good. I've actually gone ahead of like 10 minutes of class without people. Oh, interesting. My wife is going to join us. I was actually thinking about asking her. She's going to be making sure I don't say anything bad about my daughter. Hi, Michelle. Oh, she's not. She hasn't. Hi, Michelle. You thought you were going to be. You thought you were going to be anonymous here, huh?
What's that?
You thought you were going to be anonymous here, huh?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Hey, Mitra.
Hi, Michelle. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just in the car, so I figured I would listen to you guys while I was driving Colette.
Oh, she's in the car too?
No, she's not. I dropped her off.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I know.
She's the subject of today's talk. So
I know. That's why I'm curious.
But anyway, so just regarding logistics, so I find it really, really hard to manage the chat and also speak at the same time. So so if you guys are welcome. I'm not going to turn off the chat, but if you guys do use the chat, it would be helpful if somebody could just raise issues every once in a while and let me know what's going on in the chat so that I can make sure I address them. A couple things about today's talk. So this is kind of a first draft of me as a parent who has just recently had a daughter who has been accepted and accepted a university admission. And so, so I thought that it would actually be really helpful for, because I learned a ton during this process. And so I thought it'd be really helpful for me to do kind of a brain dump here. And I imagine that over the years, if I keep on giving this talk, that it'll become more and more refined. So you guys are kind of getting the first, just kind of like brain dump, which I hope is going to be helpful and useful for you guys, because I certainly wish that I had this information before we embarked on this this project of trying to get a kid into college. And if you have a younger child, this is going to be beneficial for you as well. I can tell you that I've sat through plenty of college talks. Anytime we had a UCSD or some other university try to actually explain the FAFSA and financial aid and all of that stuff to us as a school, I was always left with more questions than answers. And the main reason is because all of us have our own unique circumstances and we want our questions answered. And the truth is that those questions can't be answered until you actually have a child who has been admitted to a school and they're looking at your particular financial aid package. It's only then that anyone can possibly give you any kind of insight into how the process works for you. And so, so I've had this happen. And I was surprised pleasantly by a number of things. And so I'm hoping that I can help you guys out by having you guys get a little foresight, perhaps ease your minds in some cases, perhaps help you figure out the best ways to save money for college and the things to kind of be aware of in terms of the gotchas and that kind of stuff. So this is going to be super informal. I thought about trying to create a slideshow, and I realized that I wasn't even prepared enough to actually figure out exactly how to organize a slideshow. And so not that I don't have useful information to say, but just this is still very early in kind of my processing of this information. So hopefully this kind of off the cuff format will work for you guys. Feel free to ask a million questions, and I'll certainly try later to try to put all this down on paper so that you guys can get access to some notes that will hopefully be helpful for you to refer to in the future. One thing I do want to mention is that I am speaking just as a parent here. So I do happen to be a high school administrator. And so I do have some insight from that side of the house as well. But I am not a financial advisor. And so I am just, a few steps ahead of you guys. I've read some websites that have helped me understand my particular situation, and all I can say is that I was surprised in many cases. So might be, I encourage you to always check with a financial advisor. Don't make life-changing decisions based off of my words here. That's my disclaimer. Okay, so I want to make sure, so Miss J is on this call, and I'm going to release her from the camera. She is going to listen in. She's got dinner to cook and things to do in her house. She's got a beautiful, almost first grader now who needs her attention, and so I'm going to release her from being on camera. But I do want to introduce her. So Miss J is going to be our college advisor next year, and she is going to be taking over for Mr. Hyde, who is doing it currently. And so she's listening in on this call just in case she gets any insight, and so maybe she'll be able to answer some of your guys' questions based off of the things that I say here. You guys are always welcome to ask me questions anytime during this presentation, or really anytime. Just shoot me an email or come stop by my office and ask me questions. I have 2 more kids who are nearing college age, and so I'm going to be in this world a lot. And that's actually something I just forgot to even mention, is there's another kind of surprise thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that many of us, so I tried to plan our family carefully, and thought, okay, 4 years apart makes sense, because then you don't have 2 kids in college at the same time. And but none of our kids actually came as planned, and so we have 3 years apart for our kids. And I know that we've got families who have triplets and families who have twins, and they must be really freaking out trying to think about how they're going to pay for college. And so I think the best news that I can tell you guys right off the bat is that the multiple siblings, that's all considered and taken into account with financial aid. And if there's some magic number, let's say it's $35,000 that they expect you to pay per year, that's $35,000 regardless of whether you have 2 kids, 3 kids, 4 kids, or 5 kids. That is all they're going to be expecting you to actually pay, which is good news for those of you who have multiple kids who are college age. And also really good news for me, because we're going to have when my oldest is a senior in college, we're going to have a freshman in college. Okay, so Miss J, feel free to turn off the camera if you don't want us to watch you make dinner. I would love to watch you make dinner too while I'm talking here.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you all. I will be listening.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions, first of all, any comments before I get started? Anything in particular that you're like, can you cover this? Because this has really confused me. And if you guys are all just like, hey, this is the first time I've ever heard any of this stuff, and I'm just sitting here just trying to absorb stuff, I totally understand that, because I've been there myself. Okay, good. So do not hesitate to interrupt me. And again, if you guys are involved on the chat, please raise stuff up to my level so that I can respond to some things. Unless you don't want me to respond, that's fine too. You can have a whole secondary conversation going on without me knowing about it. All right, so let me start off by just telling my story a little bit, because I think it's important to kind of know the context here. So I've got 3 kids, and my oldest daughter is she's kind of the boss of the family, and one of those kids that always make sure that everything gets done on time, and so as a result has done well in school. And so the other thing that you should know about my daughter, though, is that she's also a super anxious person and super worried about everything. And so this has been one roller coaster of a ride for our family dealing with all of her angst over whether or not she was going to get into college. Was she good enough to go to college? Which college was the best college for her? All of these, every little tiny decision that had to be made basically drove her crazy, and as a result drove us crazy. And so if you have a child like that, then be prepared for a roller coaster ride with this college admissions process. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to try to jump back and forth between talking about financial aid kind of stuff and then also talking about just what it's like to actually have a kid who's going through this process and the kinds of supports that you're probably going to have to provide them as a parent. And so I'll jump back and forth because I think if I get too deep into the financial aid stuff, then that's going to be boring people, and but some people might want that. And so I'm just going to try to jump back and forth on those kinds of things. And so I'm going to start off with, I think the kind of the biggest surprise to me and the biggest I wish I knew that side of this. So it turns out that there are some schools that have very specific thresholds for how much money you have to make in order to have to pay anything at their school. So the biggest example here is Stanford. So Stanford, my daughter did not apply to Stanford, liked it, and it would have been interesting had she gotten in. Stanford, if you make less than $150,000 a year, you get to go to Stanford for free. And so that's huge, right? I mean, most of us think, oh, okay, these private schools, these are not accessible to us, and we may not be able to afford for the kid to get there, and you have to be a superstar in order to get a scholarship, and got to be a superstar to even get in the first place, but superstar to get a scholarship. And so, why even bother paying for the application fee, because we wouldn't be able to afford it anyway. And so, I knew that just from my experience as a high school administrator, I knew that there is financial aid out there, and I knew that people do get scholarships, and I knew that, hey, sometimes you apply to a small liberal arts school, and you'll get some money, and so maybe that'll actually wind up being cheaper or the same price as one of the state schools, and but I never thought about that in the context of a school like Stanford, because I thought, hey, this is a really hard school to get into. You're lucky if you get into that school. There's no way that you're going to get any money. And so to find out after the fact that, hey, we actually could have had a totally free ride had my daughter gone to Stanford, that would have made this decision-making process all the harder for my daughter, and because Stanford was not the right school for her. But that would have now been, hey, go to Stanford for free or do something else. So anyway, so that's, I think, something that's really, really important to know. And this is relatively recent that this is actually even possible for those of us who live in California. Another example of a school is USC. So USC, if you make less than $80,000 a year, USC is free for students. And this is a $85,000 a year school. And if you make less than $80,000, you get to go to that school for free, which is pretty remarkable. So now the question is why? And so this is actually relatively recent. And so this is what's so frustrating about this college stuff, is you really have to constantly be keeping up with it, because things change. And so it was only recently that Stanford started this, and then USC followed. And I'm sure there's going to be many other schools that follow suit. Only recently did they change it so that they do not look at your primary house as part of your income. And if you think about anyone who owns a house in California, you've probably got at minimum $500,000 in that house in equity. And especially if you bought your house 20 years ago, you probably have quite a bit of equity in that house. And so that was knocking out most Californians from ever getting any kind of financial aid, because we all look like millionaires just because we lived in a house. And yet all of us are not millionaires. We're just run-of-the-mill regular people trying to survive in California, and just happen to be in a state that has really high property values. And so that's just recently happened, that both USC and Stanford decided to get rid of that requirement. And so let's dig into that a little bit, because that's actually interesting. If you do your first read, like I did my first read of financial aid, FAFSA is the federal financial aid application. The FAFSA does not consider your property, your primary residence. They don't consider that as an asset for you. And so it turns out that that's great as long as you're applying to a state school, but the private schools don't actually use the FAFSA. They all use these other things. And so you do the FAFSA, and then when you apply to these private schools, they start asking you for these other documents because maybe they're part of what's called the CSS profile. And there's a couple of other ones that it seemed like every school had different things that they were asking us, and constantly were asking us for more information. So FAFSA, they just ask for a couple of tax forms. The CSS profile, they ask for everything. They want to know everything about you because they deal with people who probably are trying to shelter money, and they want to know whether or not they want to try to investigate and dig as deep as they can to really understand your financial picture. And so it turns out that even though the FAFSA did not look at the primary residence, the CSS profile does look at the primary residence, but only recently that doesn't matter. And so this actually turned out to be a big issue for my family. I don't want to get into the details of that because it's a little bit too personal. But this actually, after we had made the decision, my daughter had made the decision, and I wanted her to make this decision without worrying about finances. And so, but once she made that decision, I was like, oh shoot, she chose the expensive one. Then I started getting really worried about, oh my goodness, is the financial aid picture that they're giving us now, is that going to be different in years 2, 3, and 4? And that's another thing that I think is the really, really scary thing about the whole financial aid package, is that it's a 1 year at a time deal. So you get, maybe you get admitted to a fancy school. So let's say USD. USD is an expensive private school, and they say, oh, with your financial, with your FAFSA application and your CSS profile, we think that you're going to pay $35,000. And you're like, okay, I can do that. That's a lot of money, but that's what the UCSD was going to cost anyway. And by the way, anytime I talk about these numbers, I'm talking about the numbers that are all in. So you might think, whoa, how could a UCSD be $35,000? It's when you actually factor in room and board and books and all that other stuff, you always have to add about $20,000 more to whatever the sticker price is on that particular school. And so if a student gets into USD and they get financial aid that makes USD cost $35,000, what really sucks is that you now as a parent don't know whether that is $35,000 every year, or is that only $35,000 for this year? Because there's nothing worse that I can imagine than having your kid, go to USD and think, all right, I'm in my college, and they pay $35,000 the first year. And then when financial aid package comes in the next year, now it's not a $35,000 price tag. Now it's a $50,000 or $60,000 price tag. And so that's actually my biggest frustration as a parent. And I think my biggest surprise was that there isn't any certainty in terms of what the ongoing price is going to be for the college. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is about how to try to manage that uncertainty and hopefully make it be a little bit more certain. So you kind of want to have your financial picture be the same over the next 4 years. And that changes things a lot. So perfect example of this in our family, our original plan for how we were going to actually respond to college tuition needs. My wife works part-time, and we thought, okay, well, she's underemployed. So when it's time for our kids to go to college, she can work full-time, and that's, another good chunk of money, and we'll just use that to pay for college. And she actually applied for a job, and luckily, well, I don't know, I should be careful speaking for her since she's on here. Luckily, she didn't get it because it turns out that because of the college that my daughter chose, and because we were getting financial aid for her to go to that college, if we now had another whole half of my wife's income was now double because she's now working full-time instead of half-time. Now next year, instead of paying $35,000 a year, now maybe we'd be paying $60,000, $70,000 a year. And so her working extra would actually be doing nothing. We'd just be taking that money and putting it straight into college. And so that's the kind of thing that's really frustrating with the whole financial aid picture, is that it's constantly a moving target. And so we unfortunately are kind of forced into making decisions that maybe are not necessarily the decisions that we want to do as a family, and maybe don't feel ethically good for us. I mean, like, we should be paying for college, but at the same time, well, this is exorbitant. $80,000 for college, that's ridiculous. And who can afford $80,000 for college? And so you get kind of, you wind up having to make decisions that are going to hopefully make the financial aid picture look the same for multiple years. I would actually be much happier to have a guarantee and say, pay a little bit more, and say, hey, you know what? Instead of $35,000, you're going to have to pay $40,000, but we guarantee that for the next 4 years, it's going to be $40,000. Then we can make plans and we can figure out how we can actually, make the right choices for our family in order to pay that kind of cost. So that was a lot to kind of take in, I know. So let me just pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions on anything that I've said so far. And totally fine to just be overwhelmed and be like, what? I don't even know what a FAFSA is. So
Dr. McCurdy, I was just gonna chime in really quick, but this
Yeah.
was a long time ago, but it could work both ways, where your next year is, especially if you're at a UC school. I personally, I had everything paid for, but then in the middle of the year, they kept, sending more money when they had leftovers, right? So they're not allowed to have any excess income. So I received more in the middle of the year, just random money from them. So it could potentially work both ways. So it's not like all black and grim.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I remember you telling me that before, so thanks for bringing that up. So that's what we're hoping for. So maybe we'll get a magical check in the middle of the year. So let me talk about that for a second. So the other thing that's really interesting here is that every school's so when you go to a college presentation and a financial aid presentation, they tell you, it's like, okay, you do your FAFSA, and then you wind up with a number that is your expected family contribution. And that number is what drives everything. But it was never, I kept raising my hands like, okay, but does that mean that this is all coming as grants? Are these loans? I mean, it's not really helpful if it's just loans. When I'm trying to make a decision on which school that we can afford, my daughter having $100,000, $200,000 of loans is not necessarily the right choice for her. And so what does this actually mean? Does this mean that we're going to get grants? And in my mind, I thought that for sure that this meant that we were only going to get loans and that we weren't going to get grants, because you always hear that middle-class families, if you're not poor enough that you get total financial aid, and you're not rich enough that you can afford to pay everything, then you wind up being saddled in debt. And so the answer is that, at least for our scenario, we did get actual grants. And so we had private schools where the cost of the private school became the same as the cost of a public school. And so that was amazing to me. I did not think that was going to happen. I was surprised. And I thought that the only way that my daughter was going to be able to go to a private school was if she went to a smaller private school that maybe was that she was overqualified for, and that they'd be giving her scholarship money. So I knew that game was out there, and so we did have her apply to some small schools that she didn't really want to go to. But I was like, hey, you never know. I mean, if when you're trying to decide what school to go to, maybe $0 is actually going to be super attractive. So apply to these schools just to find out. And it turned out that she did get scholarships at some of those schools that would have made it so that the cost of college would have been $0. And so ultimately, that wasn't the right decision for her to go to one of those that was at the smaller schools. That wouldn't have cost anything, mostly because she had a very specific kind of career path that she wanted to go down. And so when she got into the school that was going to allow her to do that, then that was the right decision for her. So do keep in mind that sometimes, applying to a school that might be at a slightly lower tier than what you normally would get into, you might actually get some extra money through scholarships because they really want you in that program. The other thing to keep in mind is that every school has different endowments. They have different amounts of money that they're willing and able to give you. And so you could wind up having a expected family contribution of $35,000, and at one school they're like, okay, we'll give you a grant that's going to cover everything so that you're only going to pay that $35,000. But there could be another school that you apply to that doesn't have a big endowment. And so they say, okay, yeah, your expected financial contribution is $35,000, but we don't have any money to give you, so we're only going to give you $1,000 in grants, and then we're going to expect you to take out $40,000 in loans in order to meet that. And so pay a lot of attention. I didn't do this at all with the schools that my daughter was applying to, and didn't realize this until afterwards when we started looking at the actual financial aid packages and realizing that they were very, very different packages that we were getting from the different schools. And she had friends who were getting into really good schools, but these were small schools that were on the East Coast that didn't have high endowments. And so I'm pretty sure, I don't know exactly what the financial situation was of her families, but I assume that they were similar to, to our situation. And the kid was getting no money at all. And so, it sounds great to go to this really cool liberal arts school that's, small and it's going to be a great education somewhere out east. But when you have to come up with $80,000 a year, maybe that doesn't make so much sense. And so that particular friend of my daughter's wound up going to San Diego State instead, even though he got into some really prestigious schools, just because those prestigious schools didn't happen to have large endowments. So keep that in mind. Look for endowments, the endowment size. So, that's why Stanford gives free tuition for anybody who makes under $150,000, but USC only does it for people who make less than $80,000. So Stanford has a much higher, larger endowment than USC, and so that's where that difference comes in. Okay, so a couple of other things. Let me just check my notes here, just make sure I'm not forgetting something that I really want to make sure that you guys hear. So the first section was, where do you apply? And so there's a couple other things that I want to make sure that people know about. So there's the WUE program. So WUE, W-U-E, which stands for Western Undergraduate Exchange. So that is a program that basically makes gives reciprocity to all the schools that are kind of in the Western region. Not all the schools, some of the schools in the Western region. So for example, schools in Oregon, in Washington, you might actually wind up getting California state tuition rates at those schools, even though you're not a California resident. And so what's really interesting here, and this was another kind of aha moment that I had that I didn't realize before, when you look at the WUE list, it's kind of disappointing. You're like, oh, I was really hoping that we could go to University of Washington, but University of Washington is not a WUE school. And it turns out that all the UC schools are not WUE schools for the schools in Washington. So there's a little bit of, some horse trading, I think, that's going on with these states about, hey, we really want to attract students to these schools, but we're not going to get, this is our elite school, so we're not going to give kids go to Berkeley, but we'll let them go to some other school instead. And so there's a little bit of horse trading, I think, that goes on there. But so the interesting thing that I didn't know, my daughter wound up applying to Oregon State, which is not a WUE school, and got a scholarship that gave her WUE tuition at Oregon State. And so, so had she wanted to go to Oregon, there's a really good school up there, Oregon State, that was willing to let her go to school for the same cost that it would cost her to go to a UCSD or a UC Irvine or UC Riverside or UC Santa Barbara. So, so that's kind of cool. So just because you don't see the school that you want in the WUI list, do some digging through the scholarship packages and things like that, because maybe there's actually a deal where they will give you, and they don't give it to everyone, but if a kid is attractive to that school, they might actually wind up giving them a WUI scholarship. And then the final thing that I can't not mention this. So the Promise program at community college is by far the best deal for college. So the fact that you can get 2 years of college absolutely free, and then only have to worry about paying for 2 years. It's a really good deal, and you know, it's always, you know, we as a school get judged based off of where students go. So incoming families are like, oh, what school do your kids go to? You know, it's hard to not recommend going to community college and paying no fees for those first 2 years. And it's really is no fees. I mean, they pay for books and everything. So it's a really fantastic deal. The thing that you do need to be careful of with the community colleges, though, is that the student has to be super dedicated and has to make sure that they don't get stuck just taking a bunch of classes and never winding up with enough transfer credits in order to get into a four-year university. If that's going to be the approach that the kid takes, it still has to be a very disciplined kid in order to actually make it out of community college and make it into a four-year. So still something to you want to really know your kid before making that decision. Okay, so let's. So I want to come back to. By the way, I'm going to try to end by 6:30, just because you guys are going to be bored and I'm going to be exhausted and start rambling. So I do want to come back and talk about 529s and the things that I learned there. But let me take a quick detour for a while and talk about the actual application process and what it's like to deal with a teenager during this time. Somebody have a question? No? Okay. So I think the first piece of advice is that, especially now with the SAT not being used in any of the Cal State or UC schools and being optional, at least during COVID times. So for the next year at least, the SAT and the ACT are going to be optional at most of these schools. It was the whole application, the whole acceptance process was a total mess. So my daughter was comparing acceptances with all of her friends, and there was all kinds of crazy stories where somebody would get into Berkeley but then not get into Santa Cruz. My daughter got into UCSD but not Santa Barbara, but then her friend got into Santa Barbara but not UCSD. So it wound up being kind of a total crapshoot with getting into schools, because they lost one of their metrics that they use for ranking students. And so I happen to be in the camp that agrees that SAT is not a good indicator of how well a student is going to do in college. But there certainly needs to be something changed in the application process to make it so it doesn't feel like it was just totally random. And that's how it really felt this year. And so the answer is that to this is that kids unfortunately need to apply to a lot of schools. So the unfortunate thing is that it costs money to apply to schools. And so that is a place where you're going to wind up spending money. But there's, we were thankful that my daughter did apply to a lot of schools, at least in the first side of it, and on the acceptance side of it. Once you had to make a decision, that drove us crazy. So be careful if they get into more than one school, then now you have that, agonizing month and a half of trying to figure out which school to actually choose. So be warned on that end. But I think the scattershot approach of apply to a lot of different kinds of schools is, I think, the only right answer right now, because it's not really clear how decisions were made in terms of who was getting into which schools. So speaking of the SAT, my recommendation right now is, even though the SAT is not even looked at the UCs or the Cal States, it is still looked at in the private schools. And so the SAT can't hurt you. You get to decide whether or not the SAT gets submitted. And so why not take it? Why not try to do as well as you can on the SAT? Because maybe that's going to now make a school that you didn't think was accessible because you're at the higher end of their SAT range. And so now you're maybe going to be, it's not going to be a scattershot approach. And maybe you have a little bit more guarantee that you're going to get into a particular school because of that SAT score. And if you don't do well, then you just don't report the scores, and they're never going to look at it. They don't cheat and call up the college board and ask them what your SAT score was. If you didn't do well, just don't report it, and you'll be totally fine. Another thing with the actual application process, please, so I don't think we have any students on here, but if any students are listening in the background, please brag. And parents, read the entire application. So we thought we were being great parents by, reading through the college essay 20 million times and looking for every, possible punctuation error. And then we come to find out, 3 days after the application's actually been submitted, that my daughter said that she doesn't speak Spanish. I was like, she went to Argentina for a month, and she speaks much better Spanish than most high schoolers speak Spanish. But in her mind, she is not a fluent Spanish speaker, so she did not say. So when they asked her, do you speak any foreign languages? She said no. So there's kids don't naturally brag. And so they need to brag in this particular situation. And so make sure you're reading every line of the application and checking to make sure that they brag. Another really interesting thing, so San Diego State is one of those wild card schools where it's never made sense. In all of my years in education, we've never been able to figure out why some kids get into San Diego State and some don't. And this year, when my daughter was actually doing the San Diego State application, I realized, holy crap, it might come down to this one thing. They ask a question on there: how many hours do you spend on extracurricular activities? And there's 3 choices. It's less than 2 as per week, less than 2, between 2 and 6, more than 6. And so if you think about all of the kids that are applying to San Diego State, and they're ranking them all based off of what used to be SAT scores and GPA and all these other things, they don't look at any recommendations from teachers or anything like that. That there's going to be, far more kids than they can admit that are in the GPA category for getting into San Diego State. There is an essay, so maybe somebody oh, this is a great essay. So all these kids, they all wind up getting great essay too, but there's still going to be a whole bunch of kids that wind up not getting in. Are they looking at whether or not the kid said more than 6 hours or 2 to 6 hours? Is that the differentiator between whether or not they're getting into San Diego State or not? I don't know. I was super happy that my daughter in that case actually put the more than 6 hours, but I could totally see her trying to do the calculations oh, well, during the summer, I don't do theater. And so if I actually average it over the entire 365 days, then maybe it's only 5.7 hours. And so I could totally see her trying to actually answer that question honestly, and then perhaps not getting into San Diego State because of that. And so make sure that the kid is bragging. You don't want them lying. The college admissions officers can always see through lies, and they can always do double checks to make sure that the data that you're putting in is accurate. But make sure that they're at least being truthful about the things that they do, or being they're bragging about the things that they do, because kids tend to not do that. For the essays, kind of at least when I went to school, I was thinking about the one essay. It's oh, what is your college essay? You need help with your college essay. It was always the essay. My daughter must have written 40, 50 essays. And part of that is because she's crazy and she, did 20 different versions of the same essay. But a lot of it was because each one of those schools that she was applying to, they want to know that you're actually committed to their school. And so they ask their own special version of the essay. And you can't just take that same generic essay and give it to them, even if they accept the Common App. It's Common App plus a couple more essays, right? So there's just kind of plan on that. And so my daughter spent almost all her entire life from summer through December working on essays, even past December, because some of the schools still accepted essays later in the year. And the other thing that's, when we're talking about essays, the other mistake that she made and that we unfortunately let her make is she had 20 different people reading her essays. And so she was getting 20 different pieces of advice. And that was driving her crazy because she's somebody that needed to know, what do I need to do in order to get into this school? And she can meet those requirements if she knows what those requirements are. And the reality is that with any kind of admission process like this, there are humans who are reading these essays. There are humans who are looking at the application. And those humans are all different, and they all are looking for something that's slightly different. And so if you ask for 20 people to review your essay, you're going to get 20 different suggestions of what should happen. And so we had hours before an application was due, and she's like fretting because an essay that was perfectly good for the other 6 colleges that she already applied to, she's now trying to accommodate some teacher's request who said that, hey, you know what, I think maybe you should consider changing this paragraph to this. And so now she's trying to get to this new ideal world that is just based off of what this English teacher said, even though 20 other people before that said that this, so there was some other approach that was the best approach. So just know that that essay time, depending on the personality of your kid, there's going to be a lot more essays than you're imagining, and those same essays could be written a million times depending on your kid. So the same goes for letters of recommendation. The most schools, they just want 3 letters of rec. And so you look at the Common App, it's like, oh, okay, I need 3 teachers. And so you find your 3 teachers and everything's good. And then right at the last minute, there's a new college that she just hears about that she wants to apply to. And turns out that school has 2 more letters of rec that you can do if you like. And so now she's fretting about, well, if I don't do it, does that mean that they're going to think that I don't have 2 more people that actually respect me? And so maybe I need to ask for 2 more people. And so now she's asking at the last minute for letters of recommendation from, 2 more teachers or 2 other people that are involved with her life. And so luckily those teachers were happy to write letters of rec for her, and it didn't matter that it was last minute, but just something else to kind of keep in mind that, each college is going to have slightly different requirements. Okay, so I'm going to, my last section is the dealing with teenage anxiety. So I'm going to leave that for a second and go back to the financial aid side of it, because I want to make sure that I tell you guys this. And I've only got 15 more minutes, and so I don't want to not get a chance to talk to you about the financial aid. So we already talked about the difference between the FAFSA and the CSS profile. So CSS profile is for private schools. They ask for a lot more information. They want to know everything about you. And so hopefully not even necessary, depending on who you are, but if you've done any kind of research, then maybe you've heard about 529s, which is a way that you can save for college and put money into a fund that grows tax-free. And as long as you spend it on college, then you never have to pay the tax on the growth. And so we were in a situation, so we're fortunate that we have grandparents who have been saving money for our kids for college. And so we had 2 sets of grandparents. Both of them have been putting money into 529s. And so they were super excited. It's like, oh, okay, she's chosen a school. All right, so what do we do with our money? How do we start paying, using the 529 to start helping pay for her college? And the answer is they can't if we want to maintain the same financial aid picture for the next 4 years. So if my mother, for example, if she had enough money to pay for the first year's tuition and she pays for that tuition, my daughter's financial aid picture now looks like she has just made, let's say it's $40,000 that my mother is paying for that first year's tuition. It now looks like my daughter has $40,000 of income. And so the next year that we do the FAFSA, now that $40,000 of income may make it so that she doesn't get $40,000 of financial aid anymore. And now she's only going to get $20,000 of financial aid. So that money that my mother thought that she was helping my daughter with by giving it to her, actually could potentially make my daughter's college cost more. And so the actual answer, and there is no, like, at some point they're going to find out that the grandmother's got this money and is willing to help out. The answer, if the kid is not going to go to grad school, is that you don't let the grandparents start paying for college until the second semester of sophomore year. And so the reason for that is because they always look at the tax returns from 2 years prior when making financial aid decisions. And so by the time the school discovers that the daughter has, that the kid has gotten money from the grandparent, it's already, the kid is already out of school. So it doesn't work if the kid is going to be going to grad school, because when the kid applies for grad school and applies for financial aid, now it looks like, oh, guess what? You've been getting $40,000 every year from grandma. So guess what? You're not going to get any aid for grad school. So at some point it does catch up, but there are ways that you could maybe game the system a little bit to make it so that you don't wind up having to lose out on the financial aid. There's some other strategies that go in line with that. So let's say that you as a family cannot afford to pay for the first year yourself. So first of all, the money that's in the 529 that you've been saving, that's all reported on the FAFSA and on the CSS profile. And so they're like, oh, okay, you've got $20,000, $30,000 saved up for your kid. Thank you. And they expect you to spend that money on the kid. And so so that again also will minimize the amount of financial aid that you can get. And so we actually got lucky in our family, because rather than putting money into a 529, we always thought, oh, well, my wife will work more when it's time for the kids to go to school. And then luckily she didn't get the job that we thought that she was going to get when when it came time for this plan to actually happen. And so so there is no 529 that is reducing the amount of money that we get in financial aid. So kind of weird and kind of strange that you think you're doing the right thing by saving money for college, but you might actually be not actually helping yourself at all, because the financial aid gets lowered.
So you're saying you're literally disincentivized from saving money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, sounds about right.
Yeah. Yeah. So or you have the money, you put the 529 in the grandparents' account, and then wait for the right timing. So I think we're still going to screw this up, because I've got multiple kids going to college, and so I'm not smart enough to be able to figure out, well, if we start paying if my mother starts helping my daughter pay for her college, what's that going to do to the financial aid picture for my son? So we're just trying to do this one step at a time, and just like so. Stay tuned 3 years from now for my next my next presentation on this. I'm just a couple steps ahead of you guys, but not by far.
So we have 529s, but I didn't think it affected the financial aid.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, I mean, we filled out the FAFSA and probably put it in there, but I didn't see that it affected it.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure it does. I could be wrong here, and so again, but please, if anyone does figure out otherwise, then correct me. So one thing, I think the reason I know that it does is because the other strategy that you can use is, rather than having the grandparent pay for the kid's college, the grandparent, and by the way, if you're thinking like, oh, well, we won't do 529 and we'll do the gift tax and we'll gift the kid $30,000 because each grandparent can gift $15,000. That's all reported on the FAFSA as well. So you can't play that game to hide the money.
Potential application for cryptocurrency.
No, because then they'd still have to pay it. So the way around that is get the loans because they're low rate. And then once they graduate from college and don't have to worry about it, then the grandparents can help pay down the loans in the gift form.
Yeah. So we certainly thought about that. Thanks, Charles. But so Charles, let me just explain the 529 thing. So another approach that you can use. So rather than the grandparent paying for the tuition, if the grandparent gifts the 529, and some states allow this and some don't, and I haven't looked at this. I'm not sure that my grandparents or my parents would actually do this. If they give me the 529, the parent impact of the 529 is there's like a 12% tax, what they're kind of expecting you to pay out of that money. But if it goes to the kid, then it's a 20% tax. And so it is actually, there's an incentive to actually have the 529 routed through the parent and then use it to have the parent be the one that pays off the kid's debt instead of going directly to the kid. So that's how I know that the 529 does show up on at least the CSS profile. So maybe it's not the FAFSA, Charles, but at least on the CSS profile, I know it's there. So I think the kind of the bottom line here is that it's not just as easy as, oh, let's start saving for college. You want to be a little bit strategic in terms of how you actually do this. And I'm somebody who's I like to think that I'm an ethical person, and it drives me crazy that I'm playing these games of trying to hide the money. But all I really want it to do is I want to know that if you're saying that it's going to cost $40,000 for my kid to go to the school, I want to know that it's $40,000 each year, because how can I plan otherwise? And so I'm happy to once we make the decision to go to a particular school, I want to know how much it's going to cost each year. That should be part of it seems like they should be making four-year deals here and not year-to-year deals. But I totally understand it. Like, everybody's playing this game of hiding the money, and so they do everything they can to try to like find everybody's money that they're hiding. Are they hiding it in their house? Where are they hiding it? And so that's another thing. So the whole reason that I was looking at the house and whether or not the schools that use the CSS profile were considering the money that's in the house is I was actually planning on taking a home equity loan, which was going to be lower interest rate than a student loan. I hadn't done too much research, so maybe that's not the case anyway. But anyway, it was just easier money. I could just write a check from it directly. But that was actually going to hurt because they weren't going to know that I had taken out this loan. But it turns out that they don't care that you take out loans anyway. So the loans don't actually help anything. So if you've got $200,000 of debt, that doesn't take down the amount of your expected family contribution. So yeah, I don't know. I'm still in the world of trying to understand this and trying to figure this out. But I think the thing that you want to know is that it might be worth actually investing in a financial advisor who actually does understand college savings and understands it well, because I'm sure that there are people that are paying a lot less than I'm going to wind up paying because they understand how to game the system better than I do. And like I said, we got lucky. I'd be really upset if I had saved a whole bunch of money and put it into a 529 and then found out that the school was more expensive because I had done that. So the other side of this, though, is that really this only makes a difference if you're, there's an expectation that for a state school, if it seems like families that are kind of middle-class families, they're expected to pay $30,000 to $40,000 a year in tuition. And so in that case, it does make sense to save everything you can, have the 529, because you're not going to get anything anyway. So, because we didn't get anything from any of the state schools. I think one of them gave $1,000 or something like that. And so this is really only even it comes into equation because it turned out that a private school wound up being the same cost as a state school. And we're trying to make sure that that's going to be the case for the next 4 years. So 628, I know that you guys were really super excited to hear all of the anxiety stories that I was going to tell about my daughter, but we'll have to save that for a different time. Do know that because of the extreme anxiety that my daughter went through and all of the crazy, big questions, like life deciding questions, that I decided to have a senioritis support group at our school. And so I've been meeting with seniors for the last 2 months, helping them work through these things, because I realized that what we call senioritis and we just kind of laugh off as senioritis, there's some serious angst going on with these kids when they try to make these huge decisions and grapple with being an adult and having to, make a decision now that is going to impact their entire future. Even choosing between two schools that are two great schools, when you think about it, like a lot of my good friends are from college, right? So if I'd chosen a different school, then I'd have a different group of friends. And so it's like insane to make your decision based off of that, because you don't know who those friends might be. But these are like major decisions. And so if you've got a kid who's actually thinking that way, then they can just get paralyzed by just like fear of the unknown and worrying about, what if I choose wrong? What if I was going to have a happy marriage if I went to this school, but instead I married some idiot who cheated on me.
And Neil, can I add a few comments from our experience?
Please do. Yeah. So Charles has a kid in school and another one on the
2 years out. So we're same year as Neil, a senior and a sophomore.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. You too. Okay. So what I've found out is from like the FAFSA and everything else and from schools and stuff, they don't give us parents hardly any information. They expect the kids to be growing up and doing it all on their own. And in some cases, the kids being 18, we are not legally obligated to receive any of the info. So other than me filling out the FAFSA from the parent portal and putting in our tax info, which, he doesn't have that. So I do that. And then I get an email saying we're done. And then I get an email saying the FAFSA report is complete. You can check it here. Well, you have to sign in as a student. And all that did is say, we didn't qualify for grants. That's, maybe a few more were whatever grants. So I'm like, oh, great. We get to pay full price for college. Then it comes, he does all his apps. We get the acceptances to a bunch of different schools. And he has narrowed it down between two. And finally, in talking to people that have gone to both, he picks one. Well, I still have no idea other than that school, like you threw out 35,000. They said that's the cost to go there. Okay, 35,000. I'm expecting that's what we're paying. So in dealing then with the school and trying to get more info, I called them. I actually called their financial aid office and said, the FAFSA didn't tell me anything. I don't know what we're paying. I don't know what the next steps are. What do we do? And she's all like, well, my son is over 18, so we can't tell you anything, and it is for the students. But back in March, a month before he had to make the decisions, they sent him an email outlining the whole financial aid and what he was expected to pay and what they would do for them and blah, blah, blah. I never even saw that email, but he has it somewhere, I'm sure, on his computer. For the other school that he was picking or any of the others, maybe they sent an email. It sounds like Dr. McCurdy had dollar choices from different schools. I never knew about those at all. So as a parent, they do not keep you in the loop. You're going to have to ask your kid for the info from each school before you go to these final decisions. The lady at the school wouldn't really tell me much because I'm not allowed to be told, but she's like, oh, you got decent aid here. You got a $15,000 grant. Oh, wow. Well, that's very nice to know. It was already after we accepted and we're going to do it anyway, but it's good to know. Then once you get the grant money or what, if there is any, then there's like 4 different levels of loan. There's the federal loan that's really cheap, and then a state loan that's a different rate, and then the parent loan that's an additional rate. Then you can go out to the third party market and get your own loan that's at a higher rate. It's like, they don't keep us parents in the loop on anything because they expect the kids to do it. So keep in the loop yourself. Make sure your kids are telling you about the emails they receive. If they don't, ask for it.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. So yeah, I just actually prepping for this right before the meeting. I was thinking, it's like, oh, it'd be really nice to look at and compare all the different financial aid offers that we got, and I didn't get any, so they all went to my daughter, and she's busy trying to do a project right now, so I didn't want to bother her to ask for all of those. So, but yeah, the parents are out of the loop on this, but that doesn't mean that you're not paying the bill.
Yeah, they want us to pay, but don't tell us anything. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Charles. So if I'm happy to stick around and answer questions if anyone's got any questions based off of what I want to say. If you just need to process it for a while and then ask questions later, I'm always a resource. I can't promise that I know the answers, but I at least I'm a little further ahead than you guys, maybe. And if I'm not, then help me catch up to where you are. All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.